She was 21 years old when the bank took the only trade she had left in the world and handed her, in its place, a single unopened letter and a locked front door. Cornelius Pruitt, the most respected banker in Larkspur Hollow, stood on the boardwalk outside her father's print shop and explained, in the patient tone men like him reserved for young women they considered a nuisance rather than a threat, that the debts left behind by her father's illness were now the property's problem to settle, and that the type cases, the press, and the little rooms above the shop where she had lived her whole life belonged, as of that morning, to him. What she carried away from 12 years of her father's careful bookkeeping was $6.40, wrapped in a handkerchief and a stubborn refusal to leave town with nothing to show for it. So she did something the whole of Larkspur Hollow would spend weeks calling foolish. She paid $8 of those dollars for the ruined, long-abandoned Averill freight yard out at Bitter Creek Crossing, the depot from which 6 wagons had rolled out in the spring of 1855, carrying the territory's official founding papers, and had simply never arrived. What waited for her in the collapsed barn behind that depot was not a ghost story. It was a truth that an entire town had been built on top of, and burying it a second time was no longer going to be possible. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Josephine Calloway. Before we go any further, if stories like this one, about the value hiding inside things the world has already written off, mean something to you, we would be glad to have you stay with us. Press follow or subscribe now so you don't lose your place in this little circle of ours, because there are many more evenings like this one still to come. And tell us, if you would, right there in the comments below, what town or corner of the world you're joining us from tonight. We treasure knowing how far these old stories carry. Now let us go back to the beginning, to a print shop in Larkspur Hollow, and a girl who grew up believing that the written word was the one thing in this world that could not be taken from a person, only hidden. Josephine Calloway, Josie, to everyone who knew her, had grown up in the rooms above her father's print shop on Larkspur Hollow's main street, in the shadow of the great cottonwoods that lined the creek the town had been named for. Her father, Elias Calloway, had come west from Ohio as a young man with nothing but a handpress, a case of worn type, and an unshakable conviction that a town without a newspaper was a town without a memory, and he had spent more than 20 years proving it, printing the Larkspur Hollow Sentinel every week without fail, along with land notices, wedding announcements, obituaries, and the occasional stubborn pamphlet nobody else in the territory would touch. Josie's mother had died bringing her into the world, and so it was Elias who raised her. Quite literally, among the type cases, she learned her letters not from a primer, but from setting them backward in a composing stick before she was 7 years old, learned to read upside down and reversed before she read right side up, and grew, almost without noticing it happen, into the single most careful pair of eyes in her father's shop. Elias Calloway believed, with the same quiet fervor other men reserved for religion, that the written record was the one true keeper of justice in an unsettled land, that a deed, a letter, a signed testimony, properly kept and properly read, could outlast any man's memory or any man's convenient lie. Ink doesn't forget, Josie girl, he used to tell her, setting a fresh page beneath the Plyton with hands stained permanent black at the fingertips, even when the men who wrote it would very much like it to. He taught her to read not merely for meaning, but for what was missing, the gaps in a story, the names left out of a public notice, the dates that didn't quite square with each other. And he taught her, more than any single skill, the patient, unglamorous discipline of checking a thing twice before believing it once. It was, she would later understand, the exact set of instincts that would let her recognize, buried in a collapsed barn at the edge of a dead freight yard, something the whole town had spent 22 years believing did not exist. There was one particular evening, the winter Josie turned 16, that she would carry with her for the rest of her life. A farmer named Otto Reinhold had come into the shop that week furious and half desperate. Certain that a rival neighbor had quietly altered the surveyor's notice, printed the previous month to shift a boundary line 2 full rods in his own favor, though he had no way to prove it, and no money to hire a lawyer who might. Elias did not simply take the man's word for it, nor did he dismiss him the way a lesser printer, eager to avoid trouble with a paying customer, might have done. He pulled the original set type from storage, still locked in its galley from the first printing, and set it side by side with Reinhold's copy of the notice under the strongest lamp in the shop. And there, plain as day once you knew to look for it, was a single digit quietly reset between editions. A boundary marker changed from 400 to 440. A theft of exactly the kind that depends entirely on nobody ever thinking to check. Elias reprinted the correct notice that same night at his own cost, and testified to what he'd found before the county surveyor the following week. Josie, watching from the back of the shop, understood for the first time that the little metal letters she spent her days arranging were not merely tools for telling stories, but instruments capable of correcting them, and that a single overlooked digit could quietly steal a man's land as surely as any thief with a gun could. Larkspur Hollow itself carried a story it told about its own beginning, and every child in town, Josie included, grew up knowing it by heart. In the spring of 1855, so the story went, a small party of settlers, led by a resolute young man named Augustus Pruitt, had come north along the old wagon road, weathered a brutal late blizzard at the creek crossing, and, having lost their supply wagons and nearly their own lives to the storm, chosen nonetheless to stay and build a settlement on the very ground where they had so nearly perished, naming it for the wild larkspur that bloomed along the creek bank once the snow finally cleared. Augustus Pruitt was remembered as the town's founder in every sense that mattered. His portrait hung in the land office, his name was carved into the cornerstone of the county courthouse, and his grandson Cornelius had built, on the strength of that inherited reputation, the most prosperous bank in the territory. Josie had never had any particular reason to question the story. It was simply the water she and everyone else in Larkspur Hollow had always swum in. Her father's decline began quietly, the winter Josie turned 19, with a cough that would not clear, and a weariness that crept into his shoulders and refused to lift. He kept setting type anyway, because the Sentinel had never missed an issue in 20 years, and he was not about to let illness be the reason it finally did, and Josie took on more and more of the physical labor of the shop in those months, hauling paper stock, mixing ink, running the press herself long into the evening, while her father rested in the back room and, when he had strength for it, read proof by lamplight from his chair. It was during this period, though neither of them understood its significance at the time, that Elias began quietly asking questions in his letters to old newspaper contacts in the territorial capital. Questions about the original 1855 land survey records, about a freight consignment that history books mentioned only in passing, about 6 wagons that had left the capital that spring carrying, among other things, the official documents establishing Larkspur Hollow's town charter and its earliest land grants, wagons the official record noted only as lost to weather, never recovered. Elias never finished whatever story he had begun chasing. He died in the autumn of Josie's 20th year, and whatever suspicion had been forming in his mind died, or so it seemed, along with him. What Josie did not know, standing in her father's empty shop in the weeks after his death, was that Elias had signed 2 notes with the Larkspur Hollow Bank over the preceding years. One to cover the cost of a new press cylinder, one to see the family through a hard winter, and that Cornelius Pruitt, who had quietly acquired both notes from the previous bank owner upon buying the institution, held them now with an interest that had compounded well past what the shop's modest income could ever hope to satisfy. Josie had not been raised to understand banking, only ink and truth, and by the time she understood the arithmetic of her situation, it was already too late to change its outcome. Cornelius called the notes due in full on a gray morning in early spring, expressed what sounded almost like genuine regret as he did it, and took possession of the print shop, the press, and every case of type her father had spent 2 decades assembling, in settlement of a debt Josie had never had any hand in creating, and no means whatsoever of repaying. It was, Cornelius told her, simply business, nothing personal in it at all, and he even offered her a position as a seamstress's assistant with a woman he knew in town, a kindness she suspected was meant more to smooth his own conscience than to genuinely help her. Josie stood in the doorway of the only home she had ever known, while 2 of Cornelius's clerks carried her father's press out onto the boardwalk piece by piece, and she found herself thinking, absurdly, of the composing stick her father had first set into her small hands when she was 6 years old, of the particular weight of a single letter of type resting in her palm, and of how strange it was that a debt written in someone else's ledger could unmake, in a single gray morning, everything 2 decades of careful, honest work had built. She did not cry in front of Cornelius, though she wanted to. She had learned from her father that dignity, like truth, was a thing worth protecting even when protecting it cost something. Josie declined. She walked out of Larkspur Hollow's main street with $6.40 wrapped in her mother's old handkerchief, her father's small pocket dictionary tucked into her coat, and a hardened, quiet resolve that she would not spend the rest of her life grateful for other people's convenient charity. She had heard, from an old teamster named Hiram Getty, who drank his coffee every morning at the same corner of the Mercantile, that the old Averill freight yard out at Bitter Creek Crossing was being sold for whatever anyone would offer, on account of nobody in the county wanting anything to do with the place since the Wagons vanished there a generation before. Josie did not believe in curses. She believed, the way her father had raised her to believe, that an abandoned thing was very often just an unread one, and she rode out to Bitter Creek Crossing with the last of her father's dictionary in her coat, and 8 of her 6 remaining dollars. A discrepancy she would only later laugh about, having sold her mother's silver hairpin along the way to make up the difference, ready to see what the ruin actually held. The Averill freight yard sat at the low, brushy bend of Bitter Creek, where the old territorial road used to cross before the newer bridge was built a mile upstream, and it had clearly not been touched by a caring hand in 20 years or more. The depot building itself was a long timber structure, with a caved section of roof at one end, its loading dock rotted through in places, its ledger office stripped bare by scavengers long before Josie ever arrived. Behind it stood a second, smaller structure, a barn, or what had once been one, that had partly collapsed under its own weight. One whole wall leaning inward at a precarious angle, its interior choked with brush that had grown up through the gaps in the fallen roof. The land agent who sold it to her, a nervous, apologetic little man named Cyrus Feld, told her the same thing everyone in the county seemed to believe, that the 6 freight wagons lost to the 1855 blizzard had been based out of this very yard, that some folks swore you could still hear wagon wheels on quiet nights out at the crossing, and that no sensible person had wanted to touch the property since. Josie thanked him, signed the paper, and walked the grounds alone in the fading light, with a lantern her father's old dictionary had somehow, absurdly, given her the courage to carry. It was in the collapsed barn, 3 days into her work clearing brush and shoring up the leaning wall so it would not finish falling on her, that Josie's hands closed around the first piece of the truth. Wedged beneath a fallen roof beam and a generation of dust was the corroded iron rim of a wagon wheel, still bolted impossibly, to a section of axle and a splintered wooden hub, not scattered wreckage dragged in from some distant crossing, but a whole wagon, or the greater part of one, resting exactly where it had evidently been driven and abandoned inside the barn itself. Josie stood very still in the lantern light, her father's old instinct rising in her before she had even fully understood why. An abandoned wagon inside a locked barn was not the same story as 6 wagons lost to a blizzard out on the open road. Something about the shape of that quiet contradiction kept her working long past dark, clearing brush from around the wagon bed, with hands that shook less from fear than from a kind of fierce, focused curiosity she had not felt since the last winter she had spent reading proof aloud to her father by lamplight. It took her the better part of 2 weeks, working the cool hours of morning and evening, to fully clear the wagon and the corner of the barn around it, and what she found beneath a rotted canvas tarp, packed into 2 watertight document boxes that had somehow survived 22 years of dust and weather nearly untouched, changed the shape of everything Larkspur Hollow believed about itself. The first box held stacks of official territorial paper, the original town charter for Larkspur Hollow, bearing the seal of the Territorial Land Office and dated the spring of 1855, along with individual land grant certificates made out not to Augustus Pruitt alone, but to 11 separate families, homestead claims properly surveyed, signed, and witnessed, waiting only to be filed at the county recorder's office to become permanent, unchallengeable law. The second box held something rarer still, a bound travel journal, its leather cover cracked but its pages remarkably intact, kept by a wagon master named Josiah Reeve, who had led the original 1855 freight party north from the territorial capital, and recorded, in a plain, unhurried hand, exactly what had happened at Bitter Creek Crossing the night the wagons supposedly vanished. The journal told a story very different from the one carved into the county courthouse cornerstone. According to Reeves' account, the settling party that reached Bitter Creek Crossing in that brutal spring storm of 1855 had not been led by Augustus Pruitt at all, but had included him only as one member among a dozen, traveling under the practical leadership of a freed black woman named Ruth Jennings, a skilled healer and former Army camp nurse who had organized much of the party's provisioning, and whose steady judgment, by Reeves' account, was the single reason the group survived the crossing at all when the ice broke early beneath the ford. Ruth Jennings, her husband Amos Jennings the elder, and several other families, the Okafors, the Lindfists, a widow named Deborah Marsh, had all staked legitimate claims to the ground that would become Larkspur Hollow. Claims properly recorded in the charter documents Reeve himself had been transporting onward to the county recorder, when the storm forced the party to shelter at what would become the freight yard. It was there, Reeve wrote in an entry dated only days before the journal abruptly stopped, that Augustus Pruitt had proposed, quietly, reasonably, the way men like him always seemed to propose the worst things, that the party report the wagons and their cargo lost to the storm, allow the original charter to vanish along with them, and file new claims afterward under names of Pruitt's own choosing, with the Jennings family and the others conveniently omitted from a fresh telling of the settlement's founding. Reeves' journal ended without recording whether he had agreed to the scheme or simply been overruled by it, but the evidence sitting in Josie's lantern-lit hands told her plainly enough how the story had actually played out. The wagons had never been lost to any blizzard. They had been quietly walled up inside this very barn, and the true founders of Larkspur Hollow, Ruth Jennings chief among them, had been written out of their own town's history by a man whose descendants had spent 2 generations profiting from the theft. Tucked into the very back of the second document box, beneath Reeves' journal, Josie found one further item that unsettled her more than anything else the boxes held. A single loose page, torn rather than cut from the journal's final pages. folded small and pressed flat as though it had been kept somewhere close and private for a long while before finally being returned to the box. It was written in a different hand than Reeves' own, rounder, more hurried, and signed simply AP. Reading it by lantern light, Josie understood she was holding Augustus Pruitt's own private accounting of that night at the crossing, written, by its tone, sometime in the years after the settlement had grown prosperous and his lie had calcified into unquestioned local history. He wrote of the guilt that visited him some winters worse than others, of watching Ruth Jennings pass him on the street in the years before her death and feeling the weight of a debt he had never found the courage to repay, of intending, more than once, to make some quiet restitution to her family before his own conscience or his own pride always found a reason to wait one more season. He never made good on that intention. The page ended mid-sentence, as though he had simply set his pen down one evening and never picked it back up, and Josie sat with it a long while in the barn's broken light, feeling something closer to a heavy, tired pity than to hatred for the man whose theft she now held the power to undo. It did not change what needed to be done. It only reminded her that the men who commit such quiet thefts rarely escape them cleanly either, and that Augustus Pruitt had likely carried his own version of Ruth Jennings's grief for the whole of his comfortable life, even if he had never once found the courage to set it right while he still could. Word does not stay quiet long in a small county, and it did not take many weeks before Larkspur Hollow heard that the Calloway girl had bought the cursed old freight yard and had been seen riding into town with strange old papers under her arm, asking careful questions at the land office about the original 1855 survey. Josie moved with the same patience her father had taught her over a composing stick, cross-checking Reeves' journal against what public records still existed before she said a single word aloud that she could not fully support. And it was in the course of that careful checking that she first sat across a desk from Cornelius Pruitt, not as a debtor this time, but as a woman quietly assembling proof that his family's entire claim to the town's founding, and a considerable portion of its finest land, rested on a theft 2 generations old. Cornelius did not raise his voice when he understood what she was asking after. He simply reminded her, in the same reasonable tone he had used the morning he took her father's shop, that old family stories were not the same as legal fact, that stirring up questions about a beloved founder could only bring needless division to a town that had built its whole sense of itself around Augustus Pruitt's memory, and that a woman in her position, with no family, no property beyond a collapsed freight yard, and a debt of gratitude for his earlier generosity, might find it wiser to leave old ghosts undisturbed. When reasonable discouragement failed to move her, Cornelius grew less patient. Josie found the freight yard's gate forced open one morning, her lantern oil emptied into the dirt, and her carefully organized notes scattered across the barn floor, though the document boxes themselves, locked away where only she knew to look, went untouched. She found the county recorder suddenly too busy to let her examine the earliest survey ledgers, a reluctance that had not existed on her first 2 visits. Whispers moved through Larkspur Hollow that grief and hardship had unsettled the Calloway girl's mind, that she was chasing old ghost stories the way lonely, ruined young women sometimes did, and Josie understood, with a steadiness she had not known she possessed until she needed it, that Cornelius Pruitt was not merely protecting a comfortable family legend. He was protecting a fortune, a bank, and a town's entire understanding of who deserved to be remembered, and he would not surrender any of it without a fight fought quietly, in whispers and closed doors, rather than in the open. It was Amos Jennings, grandson of the very Amos and Ruth Jennings named in Reeves' journal, and the town's respected blacksmith. Though no one in Larkspur Hollow had ever thought to connect his family name to the settlement's founding, who tipped the balance in Josie's favor. She rode out to his forge with the journal wrapped carefully in oilcloth and read him his own grandmother's story in his grandmother's own recorded words. And Amos, who had grown up hearing only fragments of family memory about a hard winter and a broken promise, sat in stunned silence for a long while before he finally spoke. He told Josie that his grandmother Ruth had died, believing her family's claim to the ground beneath Larkspur Hollow had simply been lost to weather and bad luck, never once suspecting it had been deliberately buried by a man the whole town had spent 2 generations honoring in her place. That quiet grief, more than any argument Josie could have made, was what convinced her the truth could not remain a private matter one moment longer, whatever risk it carried for either of them. There came a night when Cornelius Pruitt himself rode out to Bitter Creek Crossing, alone and without the easy smile he wore in town, and stood at the edge of the depot's ruined loading dock while Josie held her lantern and did not come down to meet him. He did not threaten her outright, not in words a court could ever hold against him. He spoke instead of how much simpler her life might become if she agreed that water-stained old papers proved very little on their own, that 22 years was a long time for memory to soften into something less certain than it once was, and that a young woman alone, with no family standing behind her and a shop already lost once to circumstance, might find herself very comfortably settled if she chose to let the matter rest. He named a sum that would have bought her a fine new press and a proper house besides, offered so gently it barely sounded like a bribe at all. Josie stood quiet a long moment, thinking of her father bent over Otto Reinholdt's altered boundary notice, refusing to let a single overlooked digit stand simply because correcting it was inconvenient. And she told Cornelius, in a voice steadier than she felt, that the charter was not hers to sell at any price, because it had never once belonged to her to begin with. He turned his horse without another word and rode back toward town, and Josie understood, watching the dark swallow his shape, that she had refused him something he was not accustomed to being refused. Josie made her decision on a still, golden evening in late summer, sitting on the sagging loading dock of the Averill Depot, with the charter, the land grants, and Reeves' journal spread before her in the last light of day. She understood that careful, private research had run its course, and that Cornelius Pruitt's standing in the county would only grow harder to challenge the longer the truth stayed locked away in a barn only she and Amos knew to trust. She arranged, with Amos's help and the willing testimony of old Hiram Getty, who as a boy had once overheard his own father speak uneasily of wagons driven into the Averill barn rather than lost on the road, for the matter to be brought before Larkspur Hollow's autumn town meeting, an event ordinarily devoted to grain prices and road repairs, but one that would, on this particular evening, hear something no one in the hall had ever expected to hear about the ground beneath their own feet. The meeting hall was fuller that night than the town clerk could remember it ever being, word having spread all week that the Calloway girl intended, at last, to make good on whatever strange claims she had been chasing since spring. Cornelius Pruitt sat near the front, composed and faintly smiling, a man confident that whatever this young woman produced would collapse the moment it met daylight. Josie stood before the gathered town with Reeves' journal in one hand and the original charter in the other, and she did not raise her voice, because her father had taught her that the truth rarely needed shouting to be believed. She read Josiah Reeves' account of the crossing, of Ruth Jennings's steady leadership through the storm, of Augustus Pruitt's quiet proposal to erase 11 families from their own settlement's founding. She laid the original land charter on the table for the county's traveling notary, present that evening on other business, to examine and confirm as an authentic 1855 territorial document bearing the correct seal and signatures. And she read, last, the list of names the town had never once heard spoken aloud in connection with its own beginning. Jennings, Okafor, Lindfist, Marsh. While Amos Jennings stood quietly at the back of the hall, and more than one older resident in that room began, for the first time, to recall fragments of family stories that had never quite made sense until that very moment. Cornelius Pruitt did not deny it outright, which Josie would later think was the most telling response of all. He rose, said something about needing to review the document's provenance with legal counsel, and left the hall before the meeting properly concluded, and within the season under the plain weight of an authenticated territorial charter that could not simply be argued away. The quiet unraveling began. The county land office reopened the matter of Larkspur Hollow's earliest grants, and the descendants of Ruth Jennings, the Okafors, the Lindfists, and Deborah Marsh's family found their ancestors' rightful claims restored, acre by acre, over the better part of a year. Cornelius Pruitt did not go to prison. The theft, after all, belonged more properly to his grandfather than to him, but he lost the one thing his whole comfortable life had rested upon: the certainty, unquestioned since his boyhood, that his family's name was the only one Larkspur Hollow owed its existence to. His bank survived, chastened, but the portrait of Augustus Pruitt came down from the land office wall within the year, replaced by a plainer plaque bearing 12 names instead of 1. And Cornelius, by every account that reached Josie afterward, grew a good deal quieter and a good deal less certain of his own inherited importance for the rest of his days. Josie used none of what she found for her own enrichment beyond repairing the Averill Depot's roof and setting up, in its long, empty ledger office, a small print shop of her own, fitting, her father would have said, that a place built to hide the written record should become a place devoted to keeping it honestly instead. The town, in the following spring, voted to rename its founding celebration from Pruitt Day to Founders Day, honoring all 12 families whose names had finally been restored to the record where they belonged. And Amos Jennings stood beside Josie at that first new Founders Day gathering, holding his grandmother's story in his own hands at last, exactly as it had actually happened. And so we return to where this story began, to a 21-year-old woman standing outside a locked print shop door, with $6.40 wrapped in her mother's handkerchief, and nothing else the world seemed to think worth keeping. Josephine Calloway had lost her father, her trade, and every certainty she had grown up inside, and with the very last of what remained to her, she had bought $8 worth of collapsed barn that an entire county had spent 22 years too afraid to touch. She did not know, running her lantern light over a wagon wheel half buried in dust, that she was standing at the beginning of something that would restore not only her own good name, but the true and long-buried names of 12 founding families whose place in their own town's history had been quietly erased by a man everyone had trusted simply because no one had ever thought to check twice. What her father had taught her, that ink does not forget, even when the men who wrote it wished that it would, carried her through grief and injustice and into a vindication no inheritance could ever have bought her. The Averill Depot at Bitter Creek Crossing still stands today, they say, its press running steady once more, no longer whispered of as a cursed and haunted ruin, but remembered instead as the place where a whole town's forgotten history was finally set back down in ink, honest and complete, by a woman who had simply refused to believe that anything cast aside, a barn, a wagon, or a family's rightful place in the story, was ever truly beyond recovering. Some evenings, when the light along the creek turns the same gold it must have been that first night she stood alone in the barn with her lantern raised, Josie still thinks of her father's old words about ink and memory. and she understands now, in a way she could only half grasp as a girl setting type by his side, that he had been teaching her all along not simply a trade, but a way of seeing, a refusal to let any record or any person be quietly written out of the story, simply because it was easier for someone else that way. Thank you for spending this quiet hour with us and with Josie's story tonight. If her patience and her father's old lesson moved you even a little, we would be glad if you shared it with someone who might need reminding that the true story of a place, like the true worth of a person, is very often waiting to be looked at twice, rather than taken at its first telling. Before you go, we would love to hear from you. What is a time you discovered that the story you'd always been told about something, or someone, wasn't quite the whole truth? Tell us in the comments below. We read every one, and it is your stories that keep this little circle of ours alive. Until next time, stay close.